This review will cover several things. I wanted to take a little bit of time to go over not only the essay that's been assigned, it's your second formal essay, but also this is Grace Week, and I wanted to give you a reminder. And then, of course, I want to look at the poems in more depth, especially the ones that we've not worked with as closely as a few of the others. So going to cover a lot in the next hour. So again, these are the things that I want to discuss with you. Beginning with Grace Week, it began on Monday morning and it will continue until Monday night, the upcoming Monday night, the 21st. The whole goal of this particular period is honestly to give students a chance to make up work, 3 small assignments that they may have missed. I realize especially at the beginning of the semester as students adjust to courses, and every course is different, and mine has weekly deadlines that I adhere to, but because I am rather rigid about those due dates, unless I hear from you before the due date and you need an extension, I'm always happy to work with you in that case, but not the day of or the day after, but before the due date. But I realize that there needs to be a little bit of flexibility within that structure because life does happen to all of us. And so that's the reason I give you this opportunity. You can make up small assignments, but you cannot make up the previous test, the previous essay, or the draft of the previous essay, okay? And also, you can't go back and redo work just because you didn't like your grade. You've got ample time during a week to do most of the work that I've given you. I realize there are a couple of weeks that had more assignments than others and probably were more of a challenge, especially if you waited until the last minute. But you've got plenty of time to do most of these assignments, so you should do a good job with them as you work on them, okay? Please, if you do want to make up anything, and this closes Monday night because next Friday, I believe it is, the 25th is the last day that you can withdraw yourself from a course, any course, and receive a W on your transcript. What that means is that you will not fail the course, all right? So usually it's students who are struggling, who have trouble with the content, whose grades have sunk so low they really can't, even with Grace Week, get themselves into a position of passing. Those are the students who need to consider withdrawing from the course, because otherwise you'll probably, if you have a failing average currently and it's really, really low, then there's no chance you're going to pass at this point. So if you withdraw, always check with financial aid first, but if you withdraw from a course, what happens is it doesn't impact your grade point average, but on your college transcript there will be the title of the course and then a W next to it instead of a grade. And that just shows that you started the course but you didn't complete it, you withdrew from it. Okay. Please note that you have to withdraw yourself. You do that using the add drop in registration under MyGNTC. Okay. Now, I sent out a detailed email announcement last week. It's also in the announcements in this Blackboard course that explains exactly what to do and how to do it, but I do need for you to email me because I have to go back. I don't open everything automatically. I open assignments as students request them. So you need to email me the names of the assignments and the folders and that those assignments are found in, and then I'll be glad to help you with that. Okay, so if you have any other questions, please contact me. All right, next let's talk about the poetry analysis essay. This particular essay is quite similar to the literary analysis. Remember that the point of an analysis is to, or the point of analyzing something is to break it down into its parts and examine those parts, those pieces. And in this case, I'm asking you to look at one, maybe two different elements, right? Whether it be figurative language or I don't know, lots of possibilities, sound effects, whatever, to help illustrate diction, word choice, to illustrate how the poet develops the theme through the use of whatever, particular literary element you choose. Notice that you must have a thesis. There's got to be a point to the paper, all right? And you must use an approved poem. You shouldn't go back over something we've already studied, and you shouldn't actually choose something you've studied in the past in another course. I want this to be original work. I did include a list of poems, and if you look here at the bottom, I think I put poetryfoundation.com, but actually it's poetryfoundation.org. I think all of those poems can be found there, but if not, just use a popular search engine for the title and you can find it. Please do not do research. I'm looking for original work. Our last paper will be a research paper, and it will be introduced sort of the middle in a couple of weeks to give you several weeks to work on it. But please be aware that this is not a research paper. I don't want you to read what other people have said and then put it in your own paper. So it's very important to choose a poem that you feel comfortable with and that you think that you have a good grasp on, because I want to see what this paper shows me, among other things, is what you've learned from this unit to this point. Okay, as far as doing analysis, as far as looking in detail at, at a poem and trying to understand it. If you struggle, or if you just want a backup, please schedule a Blackboard Collaborate session with me. What I'll do is set one up. Just let me know that you want to meet. It'll take no more than 15 minutes. Tell me which poem you want to do. I will pull it up. We'll go through it. I'll make sure that you have a good understanding. We'll talk about maybe the best approaches. So I'm glad to help you in that way, but I need to know as soon as possible. Okay. So let's talk for a minute about, and again, I don't want to take a lot of time with this part. I really want to spend most of the time reviewing the contents of this week's lesson. This Unit 2 information. But again, if we were in a face-to-face class, I would distribute these guidelines, and then we would go over them. You'd read through them and I would go over them and add in the information. Please notice that the length is a 100-point assignment, and again, the length is the same as the last paper, 600 words to 750. That's kind of the bullseye of the target. You can fudge down to 550 words or up to maybe 900 and still be okay. A lot fewer than 550 or more than 900, and you really either have chosen a poem you don't have enough to say about, or you're not controlling the information, and maybe your thesis is too broad, you're trying to do too much. Okay, so it will count off, is what I'm saying. In this essay, you should analyze one or more literary elements like metaphors, diction, tone. And remember, figurative language is kind of a category. Similes and metaphors and symbols are all forms of figurative language. So what I would recommend is you break it down something more specific. Diction, of course, is word choice. How does the poet use certain words to create a certain effect, or to support the theme of the piece? Or tone, and of course diction is actually used to create tone. It's the words and the imagery that a poet uses to evoke a certain feeling. All right. Again, it has to be an approved poem, and what you want to do is show how the element or elements, and you may choose more than one, but what you should not do is go through and, for example, like our poetry analysis sheet where you look at everything from the turn to the this to the, working through it. It shouldn't be everything you can find in the poem. Again, this needs to be a focused write, okay? And I gave you 2 student samples. Those were actual student papers. Please be sure and look over those, because anytime I give you, if you're like I am, if I can see how somebody else successfully did an assignment, then I'm more likely to be successful. Okay, so please go back and look at those. So in other words, don't throw everything, and yeah, I think the expression, and this is probably a cliche now, but everything but the kitchen sink. Don't try and be impressive with all that you understand about a poem. Instead, focus in on specific aspects and develop those very carefully and very thoroughly. All right. Again, it must be approved. If you want to do a poem by a poet that is on that list, or a poem that you think by a poet that's maybe not on that list but you think is of comparable merit, all right, then you must get that approved first. So email me. Okay, and this is where this should be .org, not .com. All right, be sure to read the information about Purdue OWL about writing poetry analyses. I gave you a couple of reading assignments there. I'm not requiring that you use the poetry analysis worksheet, but I hope that you see how it's useful and beneficial because it requires you to thoroughly, if you do it well, to thoroughly take apart a poem and look at all these different aspects of it. And as I think I've mentioned in the past, my goal is to not make this unit. I love poetry. I really, I enjoy it. I enjoy the study of it. I'm passionate about it, but I realize a lot of students, if not most of them, are not, in the sense that you like what you like, and you want it to mean what you want it to mean. And I understand that. That's totally a way to subjectively approach poetry, and that there's value in that. But I think I may have used the example in the past of it's kind of like me and understanding basketball. It wasn't really until I couldn't play it and I never kind of understood the ins and outs of that particular sport. I'm passionate about a lot of sports, particularly football, but basketball was just never my sport until somebody explained to me, kind of the terminology and how things work. So I learned what a pick was and the role of the point guard and the different, man-on-man versus zone defense and all that. And though I'll never play basketball, quite frankly, I have a better understanding of the game and a better appreciation. I feel more like an insider since I know more about it. And so that's my goal, actually, of having you work with the poetry in an analytical, more objective way rather than a subjective way. I want you to enjoy it. I hope you've read some things that you enjoy. But the goal here is actually to teach. Right, to open up something a bit more, to give you an understanding of how people who really know what they're doing put these things together in a way for maximum impact. So again, you're not required to do the analysis, but feel free to do it. And if you do analyze a poem that you're going to want to write about and you want to send me that analysis sheet for some quick feedback, I'll be glad to do that. Again, you can schedule an appointment. I didn't put, because we're being very cautious about inviting any other viral information, any malware into the course. I used to use this free online schedule an appointment app, and I'm not going to do that this time because I'm not sure how safe it is. So instead, just email me and I'll set up a Blackboard Collaborate appointment with you. So choose a poem with which you feel comfortable. This is very important. If you do research, the paper cannot pass. And I can tell, quite frankly, because I'm aware of what's out there, especially the course essay and student different guides to help students understand. This particular poem I want you to do on your own. So please, please, please do not use external source material, because then what you're doing is you've turned it into a research paper, because what you'll end up writing about, even if you put it in your own words, is what you found out, from somebody else. All right. So choose a poem on the list, develop a thesis. What's the main point? And what are some elements that help support that point effectively? Remember that what's the theme, and remember that theme is not the subject. A lot of students are still misunderstanding that. Theme is, for example, not love. It's love is the only thing that you need to survive. Okay, what is the point that the author wants to make about love? So again, a theme is the subject plus the poet's attitude or main idea about that subject. Okay, I recommend you review, take notes, use the poetry analysis sheet. You don't have to submit any of this. I just want to see your draft. Draft the paper. Of course, it doesn't have to be perfect, but try to get 4 to 6 paragraphs. Anything too short, you won't receive credit or full credit for a draft, which is a 10-point participation grade. Be sure and get those into me. by next Monday. I do not take late drafts unless there are verifiable emergencies. I will again record feedback as well as type some feedback. The better your draft, the more that I can just help you clean up small errors. If you wait till the last minute to do this and throw ideas down, then there's not a lot that I can help you with except maybe try and get refocused. Be sure and get the paper in on time. My feedback will be available by next Thursday, if not sooner. I will email you if I finish sooner. And then the final paper is due in the week 11 folder. And notice that your final paper, you've got plenty of time to revise because spring break begins on March 28th. So I'm not requiring your folder, your week 11 folder will not open until, as a matter of fact, I will go ahead and open your week 11 folder next Tuesday, but the assignments will not be due until after spring break, which is April 4th, okay? So just by way of explanation. March 31st doesn't begin spring break. It's actually March 28th. That's a mistake. And we will start our drama unit. That will be the third unit is on drama. So we will begin that. Actually, it'll open next week. Okay. You may submit the final paper up to 3 days late with a penalty, so it's 10% per day. After 3 days, it will not be accepted. Again, what I've done here is actually it's redundant, but what I repeat by actually numbering the guidelines and adding a little bit of additional information. By the way, please do not worry about MLA documentation for this. The one thing that you do need to do, though, is identify the line numbers in the text itself. And if you look at those sample essays and you read the section in Purdue Owl, it will explain how to do that. But we're not going to worry about MLA documentation since you're only working with one poem and you're finding them online. We're just not going to be concerned with that. But what you do need to do is put the line number, and I have some information here about how to do that. So in the text, if you say, in line 5, the poet says, okay, and remember to work very closely with the text. Always quote lines. It's not enough just to say something. Show how it's true by actually quoting lines that contain that information, okay? But if you don't mention the line number in the text, do this. L indicates one line, line 3, okay? LL is actually an abbreviation for multiple lines. I know that looks like one, sorry. 3 through 7, okay? And that's how you identify. If you don't actually say it with words, then this is the only in-text citation you need, okay? Use the appropriate page format. So again, and I just, on the other, I just went over number 11 on the other page. Please remember you need your header in the upper left-hand corner. Please double space between your lines, not your paragraphs. Please use a 12-point regular font and so forth, okay? And indent the first line of each of your paragraphs. Should you have questions about any of this, please do not hesitate to ask me. And I think that's gone over pretty much everything there. Now let's talk in general about, let's talk about the Unit 2 test, okay? It will open tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. All of your information should be graded at that point, by that point. It's the same, and so you have until Monday night at 11:59. It's the same format as the previous test. You'll have multiple true, false, multiple choice. You'll have a matching section that purely has to do with matching a word to its definition. And most of the words will be taken from the poetry analysis sheet definitions, okay? I recommend you actually have copies of your poems available or open on in separate tabs on your computer so that you can refer to them, because you can use your poems, you can use notes, right? What you can't do is look up answers online. That's immediately you'll fail the test, okay? Not just that question, the entire test. And my suggestions for study, besides, of course, this video that I'm creating now for you, go back and look at the One Art analysis video, okay? Because One Art, the poem will be on the test. You will be tested on it. Look over your answers to Hate Poem, especially if you missed anything. I emailed a copy of, in previous classes, I collected student responses and just kind of compiled them. And so they're kind of examples for best answers to those questions. So if I emailed you that, take a look at it. And the way that you'll know that is if you open My Grades, it's usually right there in the comments section. Look back at any discussions and wiki posts, and notice that even though you only had to do a formal analysis with that worksheet on one poem, you're responsible for all 4 poems in that particular week's folder. So look at other people's wikis, all right? And my comments to what those wikis, the posts there. So yours, mine, and ours, okay? If you have any questions about the test, please let me know. I don't reset tests unless there's a verifiable reason that you could not complete it. Make sure you're working with Google Chrome, or make sure that you are working with Mozilla Firefox. And actually, both are free downloads. They're free browsers. And they're the only 2 browsers that are supported by Blackboard, or that support Blackboard. Okay, that's the reason things will jump around. You can't type certain things if you're using a different browser. So please avoid those kinds of problems, because I do not like to reset. I don't reset tests unless you can verify to me that something happened as you were taking your test. Okay. Finally, let's talk in general about approaches to poetry. Always read for irony first. Do not assume the poem means exactly what it's saying, unless, and the exception to that is what's called lyric poetry. Lyric poetry expresses, think about song lyrics. It expresses strong emotion usually. So for example, the poem, I Am Offering This Poem by Jimmy Santiago Baca, which is one of the poems you studied, is an example of a lyric poem, and it means exactly what it says. I'm offering this to you. I don't have much to give. And it's full of all this imagery that has to do with just the basics of staying alive. And we're going to take a look at that particular poem in a minute. But a poem like Hate Poem, the whole thing is ironic. A poem like Siren Song, ironic, okay? Always read for irony first, not only poems, but short stories and other works, and rule it out. Does it mean what it's saying, or is there something, and usually if you can find the turn, it will indicate that there's a shift here, and it shifts to something else, okay? Lyric poetry doesn't usually have a turn, by the way. It's because it's not suddenly shifting to a different idea. Again, a theme is not the same thing as a subject. So theme, when you're talking about a poem's theme, yes, it concerns some subject: death, love, hatred, I don't know, breakups. That's the subject matter, but the theme is the point that the poet wants to make about subject matter. Always pay attention to titles in poems. A lot of times that will indicate, sometimes it's really helpful. It will definitely indicate what the entire poem's about, and give you sort of a hint about how to read it. Always look at punctuation. For example, you've had several examples of poems that contain no punctuation. They're just continuous. And so what that indicates is that things are ongoing. It doesn't stop. The time doesn't stop. And so that's how that gives you a little bit of an understanding, and we'll look at that again in a minute, about it's a particular effect that the poet's doing intentionally to indicate kind of the theme of the work. Imagery, of course, in the last week's lesson you were to work with, and imagery has to do with the senses. It's not just what you can picture, that's what we tend to think of image, but it's sights, smells, tastes, touch, right? Let's see, sight, smell, taste, touch, feel, okay? So anything that evokes one of your senses is considered imagery. Okay, sound effects. I realize that students don't necessarily notice this, but sound effects can be very, very important. And I think I went over this in the One Art video, which I realize is lengthy, but it's the setup to, it's the first thing I always do in any class about poetry, is to kind of go through all of these different things and explain why they're significant and how they function in a poem. And I think I used the example of having studied and/or taught poems before that had like a lot of B sounds. One of my favorites is a poem about Cupid, the modern day Cupid, and there are a lot of B sounds like battering, like how you get beaten up in modern day love relationships. And so there were a lot of B words that sound like they're harsh sounding, and it feels like, you know, being beaten basically. Sounds about sailing in the sea often have a lot of SHs and Ws and WHs. Whoosh, and so the sound effect, if you think about it, often it's often rhythmic, and it has to do, like, it comes in waves. The way the words are, the things are, the lines are punctuated. And then always look for a turn. Again, lyric poetry may not contain a turn, but most other poems do. And that's where you can actually, if you can find the turn in a poem, it's often close to the end, not always, but often. That's when you can start pulling it up. Okay, aha, you know, now let's see what's happening here. Again, it's important to note the difference between subjective response and objective. An objective is when you can analyze something and see how the poet put information together to create a certain effect or to illustrate a certain theme. I also want to heavily emphasize this. There is a difference between the poet and the speaker or persona that the poet creates to do the talking. Okay, the voice in a poem. So when I ask, for example, in significant passages for you to identify the speaker, the poem, and the significance of the lines that I present, and again, you'll get to choose, I think it's either 3 of 6 or 4 of 8. Please do not write about all of them. But when I ask for the speaker, I want to know who's doing the talking, and not the poet, but the persona that the poet's created. So, for example, often you can tell age. Like in One Art, as I mentioned, it was probably a female speaker. It was probably someone who's a bit older because she's had a lot of life experience. So that's what you can say. The speaker is probably a woman with a lot of life experience. Okay, even though there's no name, because what poets do is they do create personas. Persona comes from it's a Latin term, and it's the mask that that actors would wear, those masks that never changed, right? In Greek theater and Greek drama, which we'll talk about starting next week. But it's a mask that never changes, and so the actor speaks through that mask. It's acting. And so what poets do, sometimes they're representing themselves, yes, in their own experience, but sometimes they're also creative people who use their imagination to create a world, and they use characters that they create. They're not technically characters like in a story, but they create speakers who have certain experience that the poet may never have had. Emily Dickinson frequently wrote about things that never actually happened to her, but she wrote as though they did by creating these speakers who had these experiences. Okay, so I hope that's helpful. Now let's go on and look at particular poems themselves. I'm going to start with some of the most recent. For example, the Shakespearean sonnet. As I mentioned in the One Art video, if we were in a class, you know, it really is a beginning student who thinks you can read something one time and understand it, especially poetry. Poetry bears reading and rereading, and because often you'll see something different or something more every time you revisit a poem. And so if we were in a class face-to-face, I would read the poem aloud the first time, just to make, in case there's any language that's unfamiliar, or just to try and establish the rhythm. And then I would get a volunteer from the class to read it the second time, and then we would discuss. The Shakespearean sonnet, a sonnet you may have studied before, but basically a sonnet always looks like, one of the ways you can tell that it's a sonnet, there are actually several ways, but it is always 14 lines. and it looks like a little box. It looks like a little square. Shakespearean sonnets are, even though all of this is written together as one stanza, it's usually grouped by 4 lines, okay? So these 4 lines are all an idea. These 4 lines are all an idea. These 4 lines are all an idea. That makes 12 total lines. And then it ends with a couplet, a rhyming couplet, okay? Shakespearean poems, and I'm just telling you, you're not going to be tested on this, but just FYI. Shakespearean poems, the rhyme scheme is A, B, A, B, all right? So here's your A, sun and done. Here's your B and your D, because the way that you do it is in looking at rhyme scheme is you use a lettering system. So this is A, B, C, or A, B, and then it's back to A again, then B. White doesn't rhyme with either one of those, so now you've got C. Cheeks do not rhyme with any of the previous words, so now you've got, let's see, C, D. Then delight rhymes with white, so it's back to C, and then cheeks back to D. Again, just FYI. The turn in most Shakespearean poems is here at the couplet. Sometimes it's before then, but most turns in Shakespearean poems actually are here. And this is where, again, if you can find the turn and then look at how the lines that are past it contrast to the lines before it, you can see what the poet was intending to do. So, my mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. And by mistress, he means woman. Of course, this is Elizabethan language to some extent. My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. I have seen roses damasked red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. And in some perfumes there is more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. And that's, talk about diction. That word, is really disturbing, right? Very evocative, definitely sensory. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music, and notice when you're reading poems, by the way, you let the punctuation tell you when to stop and start. So since there's no comma, period, semicolon, anything here, you don't stop. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground, period. Okay, so until this point, what you get a picture of is this speaker in a love relationship with a woman, but what he is refusing to do is he is refusing to praise her the way a lot of love poetry uses, over the top language about how beautiful somebody is. And if you've ever read Lord Byron's She Walks in Beauty Like the Night of Silver Stars and Starry Climes, that's a poem that's over the top. Right? It's like in describing this woman, he's just, it's unrealistic. It's like that whole idea of putting a woman on a pedestal. And so what this speaker is doing is he's refusing to, okay? But the turn shows you how much he cares, because this would almost give you the idea. A lot of this is almost humorous language. Her breath stinks. Her skin is not beautiful. She doesn't walk like a goddess. Her speaking, her speaking voice is not that lovely. But the reality is here at the turn, what he basically is saying is, but I think she is amazing. In other words, and yet by heaven, I think my love is rare as any she belied with false compare. So everything that he's done before this is making fun of false comparisons, of this over-the-top flowery language that a lot of poets use to write about their love interests. And he values, notice, I think my love as rare. And so this line itself is enough to be more powerful than anything that would have possibly he could have said that would have been over the top. Does that make sense? And so that's why this is the turn. And yet, okay, is the signal here that we're going a different direction. By heaven, I think my love is rare as any she belied with false compare. And that basically means false comparison. Saying things that that technically I'm not going to speak untruths about her, but yet she is very precious to me. All right, so I hope that makes sense. It's not that complicated to understand, but I wanted to make sure that that you did have a feel for what was happening in this poem. All right, let's take a look at Jimmy Santiago, because now this is again is a lyric poem. It will not contain a turn. It has a lot of repetition, especially of the words I love you, I love you. As a matter of fact, you can tell by the way that he has organized the poem to have these stanzas punctuated, and notice that there is a point at which the sentence structure is such that there are more clauses and clauses and clauses and clauses and clauses before you get to that final period. Okay, and so that's intentional because it's cumulative. It's this and 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 it's this. Okay, so I'm offering this poem to you. I'm offering this poem to you since I have nothing else to give. Now there's your first period. I have nothing else to give. So the poet is basically, the speaker in this case is basically saying, and often in lyric poetry, there's not necessarily a persona, it is the speaker expressing strong emotion, or the poet expressing strong emotion. I have nothing else to give. Keep it like a warm coat when winter comes to cover you. So there's your first image. This whole idea of you've got winter, and winter can be symbolic of hard times, right? Of difficulty, you know, or even old age. So a warm coat to cover you, or like a pair of thick socks the cold cannot bite through. I love you. Now this is where, when you read it aloud, you can tell the sound effect of not having a period, stopping it until the very end. All right. I love you. I have nothing else to give you. So it is a pot full of yellow corn to warm your belly in the winter. It is a scarf for your head to wear over your hair, to tie up around your face. I love you. Keep it. Treasure it as you would if you were lost, needing direction in the wilderness life becomes when mature. And in the corner of your drawer, tucked away like a cabin or a hogan in dense trees, come knocking, and I will answer, give you directions, and let you warm yourself by this fire, rest by this fire, and make you feel safe. I love you. It's all I have to give, and it's all anyone needs to live, and to go on living inside when the world outside no longer cares if you live or die. Remember, I love you. Okay, so I hope reading it out loud gives you kind of a different effect. You can see how it almost gets overwhelming with the emotion in the poem. So we start out with this winter image. Now, this poem always reminds me, I don't know if you've studied yet, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I've studied it about 12 times in college. I studied in political science, I studied in psychology, I studied it in a literature class, I studied it, oh gosh, there was another, may have been education. Anyway, where the idea with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and it's a theory, but you have to have lower levels of your needs met before you can go on to upper levels. So the very base layer, the most important layer are at the very bottom are physiological needs. And physiological needs are things like shelter, you know, and warmth, right? Comfort. You have to have food, you have to have water, you have to have air. The very basics that it takes to keep a human being alive. That is the base level of Maslow's hierarchy. And then after that comes law and order needs. Okay, so you need to feel safe in the world. And then after that comes the need to belong. So, you know, once those two levels have been met, you feel safe in the world, right? And you feel, you know, you can eat and you have water and so forth. Then the next level is belonging. You have groups or people to whom you belong. You feel like you fit someplace. And then the next level is you go into self-actualization needs, where actually you can take if all those needs are met, then a really healthy person can then go on and maximize everything that they need to survive in life, right? And not only survive, but to thrive and to give back to the world and to use their talents. And so you can see how this poem builds on Maslow's hierarchy in some ways, because basically the speaker is saying, I've got nothing to give you except these basic things you need for survival. And this basic thing is love. So he's comparing it. Notice all these similes, like a warm coat that covers you when winter comes, like a pair of thick socks. So this is warmth, right? So this is one of the physiological needs. And by the way, I've taught students who really their home lives weren't safe, or they had difficulty knowing where their next meal was coming from. They could care less, quite frankly, about a lot of things in life that others who are in a more safe environment can care about, because they're just trying to get those basic needs met. If you've ever seen somebody, or if you yourself have lived through that, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So this poet's going, this is what you need. This is what you need. I have nothing else to give you. So it is a pot full of yellow corn. There's your next image. And notice it's yellow. Yellow is sunny and glowing and feels healthy. I mean, anytime you've got colors in a poem, pay attention to them, all right? Because colors often create tone and mood, as well as they function symbolically. And so yellow can be a bright, sunny, warming color, right? So it's yellow corn. And so that's another hierarchical need, right? The physiological need for food to warm your belly in the winter. So we're still in the winter when tough times come. It is a scarf for your head to wear over your hair, to tie up around your face. I love you. And so this picture starts, again, we have another, that whole covering your ears, staying safe. Keep it, my love, right? Keep it. Treasure it as you would if you were lost, needing direction. So here's the next level, which is talking about safety needs, right? Law and order or safety, that you need to feel safe. If you were lost, needing direction, and the wilderness life becomes when mature. So like little kids maybe do not see life as the wilderness so much as perhaps adults at certain points, especially when crisis comes. And in the corner of your drawer, tucked away like a cabin or a hogan, and a hogan, by the way, is a form of Native American housing. You can look that up online, or Native American structure, in which some may still live in hogans, I don't know, but it was a common structure, I think, especially of the Midwestern Native American populations. Tucked away like a cabin or a hogan in dense trees, come knocking. So in other words, there he is in this cabin, and I will answer, give you directions. I'll help. I'll provide safety, let you warm yourself. So there's that other warmth by this fire, another image, rest by this fire and make you feel safe. Again, that's level 2 of Maslow. I love you, and notice these are just brief pauses with commas, brief separations. It's all I have to give, and it's all. And this, of course, refers back to that first line. I have nothing else to give you, and it's all anyone needs to live and to go on living inside when the world outside no longer cares if you live or die. Remember. And then that break again, I love you. And the I love you, of course, is supposed to stand out. That's the point of this poem. That's the whole idea behind it. Is this love relationship. It means exactly what it says. There is no irony here. But what Bacall does is he uses these different images to project how essential love is to our survival. All right, let's go from this one to Siren Song. Now, sirens, if you were unfamiliar with the mythology, sirens were half bird, half woman. And especially if you ever studied the Odyssey, they came up in the Odyssey. I mean, they were mentioned in the Odyssey, and I guess in some other Greek drama at the time, perhaps. But they definitely were in the Odyssey with Odysseus after the Trojan War, trying to make it back home again to Ithaca. And so the sirens were these half bird, half women creatures who lived on the rocks and essentially would sing. And their song was so beautiful that they would lure sailors closer, which then their sailors' ships would crash on the rocks, okay, and die. And but Odysseus, according to the Odyssey, wanted to hear the siren song, so he basically had his men tie him to the mast so he couldn't get free. And he had his men then stop up their ears with beeswax so they couldn't hear the song. So that was how he was able to actually hear it and enjoy it without then dooming his ship. Okay. So I'm going to read it in its entirety, and then as I would if we were in a class, and then I'm going to point out some things you may not have noticed. Siren Song. This is the one song everyone would like to learn, the song that is irresistible, the song that forces men to leap overboard in squadrons, even though they see the beach skulls, the song nobody knows because anyone who's heard it is dead and the others can't remember. Shall I tell you the secret? And if I do, will you get me out of this bird suit? I don't enjoy it here squatting on this island looking picturesque and mythical with these two feathery maniacs. I don't enjoy singing this trio fatal and valuable. I will tell the secret to you. To you, only to you. Come closer. This song is a cry for help. Help me. Only you can. You are unique. At last. Alas, that's a boring song, but it works every time. Now, I hope that wasn't a perfect reading, but I hope from the way that my tone and inflection changed with the wording and with the action of the poem, you can get how the tone changed, because the tone in this poem changes frequently. So first thing that you need to notice are the fact that there are a lot of run-on sentences. So again, punctuation matters here. For example, the first, let's say we've got a colon. Colons mean something's going to follow. Pay attention to what follows. It's additional information. And then our first period is not until the third stanza. Okay, so if you read this, you do pause a bit for the colons, but after that, these all run together. Okay, then we end this with a question. Okay, this next stanza with a question, and this is why this is significant. Notice that this is very general, and it's talking to a general audience. So the audience in this particular poem changes from a general one to now she's found her target. She's honing in. If I tell you this secret, all right, she singled out somebody. Will you get me off this bird suit? So she's trying to engage him. And then here's her method for trying to engage him. And notice that this is continual until here, where she starts complaining. I don't enjoy it here. I don't want to be doing this with these two feathery maniacs. All right, so there are three of them. They're in bird suits. I don't enjoy singing this trio, the three of us, fatal and valuable. And then it gets more intimate. I will tell the secret to you, only to you. Come closer. All right, so here's the seduction, right? This song is a cry for help. Now notice the tone changes again. So it starts out, and the word I'm going to use here is it starts out didactically. There's several poems that are like this. One art can be considered didactic in parts until you get to the ironic ending where the speaker gets desperate. Didactic means instructional, all right? Like you're teaching. It's that kind of objective tone where you're talking to a lot of people. This is the one, so didactic. It starts didactically and kind of general, and then it gets more personal. So here, shall I tell you the secret? So it becomes seductive, all right? And then it becomes complaining, all right? So you've got somebody, the tone changes to one that's sort of, if we want to use adjectives here, it would be, I don't know, I guess complaining is an adjective. And then I will tell the secret to you, then it becomes intimate, all right? Only to you, all right? So a little bit more seductive, a little bit more intimate, and then it becomes a cry for help. So then it becomes, I guess the right word would be desperate. Help me. There's a cry for help. Help me. Only you can, right? So it's the seduction continues, but the target, the audience target, doesn't realize that he is being seduced. Help me. Only you can. You are unique. you know. And so this whole thing about, you know, the guy on the white horse. I'm a woman in distress. I don't want to be here. Come help me. And you are unique. And then this gap here indicates at last indicates the guy jumped. All right. He bought it. He took the bait at last. And then here we have, here's your turn. Alas. Okay. This is your turn, and this is how you know that this whole thing has been a setup. It's a boring song, but it works every time. So this is a modern retelling of a siren song about a woman who basically more or less pretends to be in distress, needs help, singles out somebody. And here's some things that there's not a lot of imagery here, but here's a couple of pieces of imagery that's important. Forces men to leap overboard in squadrons. In other words, it works on everybody, even though they see the beached skulls. In other words, they know better. There is evidence. And beached skulls, it's like losing your head. All right. Think about that symbolic or metaphorically, losing your head. So this person has a track record. Her history is known. It doesn't matter. Because this little thing, telling somebody they're unique, they're the first one, they're the only one that you've ever felt this way about, works every time. Okay. All right, so hopefully that was helpful. Let's go from that to hate poem really quickly. I think from reading your answers, most everybody understood that this particular poem was heavily ironic. This speaker, all right, we know it's a female because it talks about breasts, right? So we know that it's a female. Just like the last poem, we know that it's a female. But this particular speaker does not hate this person, and I'm going to show you why. Besides the last two lines, which of course this is where the turn is, with my lungs duplicitous twins, can never have enough of you. So if you can't get enough of somebody, you are absolutely addicted, right? Even though you recognize that the relationship's going down. You know, a broken submarine is taking on water. If you need air to breathe, you're not going to be able to breathe much longer, and that's where the lungs come in here, okay? But so that turn shows us that this poem is ironic. It doesn't mean that she's absolutely furious. Oh, sure. You know, but here's another way that we know that this poem is ironic. These images are funny. If you really hate somebody, you talk about taking an axe or, you know, something that's a little bit more kind of frightening. You don't talk about the way I hold my pencil hates you, my wrist hates you. The tiniest bones were they trapped in the jaws of a moray eel hates you. Every corpuscle in its capillary. Yeah, this does express strong emotion, but that's part of the reason that I use the title for this unit. It's a thin line between love and hate. That's a great old R&B song. I don't know if you've ever heard it before, but the idea here is people who evoke strong emotion in you, that same emotion can switch to the opposite, right? You know, if you feel really strongly about somebody and something happens, you don't just, oh, okay, and lose, and then the emotion drains out. It usually, the inverse can be possible as well, or at least you go through that kind of period. So I'm going to read this through and point out a couple of things you may not have noticed. And then we'll try and finish up with the last few. Hate poem. I hate you truly. Truly I do. Everything about me hates everything about you. The flick of my wrist hates you. The way I hold my pencil hates you. The sound made by my tiniest bones were they trapped in the jaws of a moray eel hates you. Each corpuscle singing in its capillary hates you. Look out! Four! I hate you. That's funny. Like a golf swing. The little blue-green speck of sock lint I'm trying to dig from under my third toenail left foot hates you. The history of this keychain hates you. My sigh in the background as you pick out the cashews hates you. The goldfish of my genius hates you. My aorta hates you. Also my ancestors. Again, I hope you can see the humor of these images. A closed window is both a closed window and an obvious symbol of how I hate you. My voice, curt as a hair shirt, hate. My hesitation when you invite me for a drive, hate. My pleasant good morning, hate. You know how when I'm sleepy, I nuzzle my head under your arm? Hate. Okay, so notice this relationship is ongoing. All right. Good morning. Hesitation when you invite me for a drive still goes, just hesitates. Um, Nuzzling heads under arms, hate. And of course, it's not true. The whites of my target eyes articulate hate. My wit practices it. My breasts relaxing in their holster from morning to night hate you. Layers of parfait, of hate, a parfait. Hours after our latest row, brandishing the sharp glee of hate, I dissect you cell by cell so that I might hate each one individually and at leisure. My lungs, duplicitous twins, expand with the utter validity of my hate, which can never have enough of you, breathlessly like two idealists in a broken submarine. So it's like these two people are trapped in this relationship. Notice that it's latest row. The word row here means little fight, spat, okay? They're going after each other, but they can't get away from each other at the same time. I don't know if you know people like this or have ever have been in a relationship like this, but it's the whole idea of not wanting to leave the relationship, but still not being able to get along all the time. Okay, this intensity of feeling. All right, I hope that was cleared up any misunderstanding you might have about that poem. Let's go on to Those Winter Sundays. Most everybody understood it. Robert Hayden wrote this poem. He actually he was adopted, and his father was a pastor. But you need to use the word speaker instead of poet here, because again, he is creating a certain persona, but we can see parts of his life autobiographically that show up in this poem. Those Winter Sundays. A couple of things to notice. You know, Sundays too, my father got up early. Most people think of Sundays as a day of rest, right? So notice that the word to here indicates, whoa, didn't mean to go that large. To here indicates he gets up every day early, okay? And put his clothes on in the blue-black cold. Now, blue-black is cold. You know, it's that whole idea of like in winter. So again, we have winter. Think about the symbolism of winter, cold. Anytime you have a season, anytime you have colors, think about how they function symbolically. Okay. Then with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather. So notice this is a man who works outside, whether he's a farmer or a day laborer somewhere, he works outside and made banked fires blaze. There's alliteration here, the B's, banked fires blaze, weekday weather. That creates a certain effect here. That's harsh, banked and blaze, blue, black, harsh. B sounds are harsh. Hard C sounds are harsh, cold, cracked. Those are considered cacophonous if you think back to the sound effects. Cacophonous language. No one ever thanked him. So notice all of this is part of one period. All of this is grouped together, and then no one ever thanked him. I'd wake and hear the cold splintering breaking. So there's another harsh B sound. There's another harsh C sound. There's another harsh C sound. When the rooms were warm, he'd call. So the kids, everybody else got to stay in bed until the house was warmed up because of a fire that this father built. Now, obviously, as we know, and as most of you caught on, you know, this is a son looking, probably a son looking back, and with regret, with remorse. The tone of this poem is remorseful. It's bittersweet. There are lots of words you can use there, but it's somebody looking back and recognizing, perhaps for the first time, that even though the father may have never shown any other acts of love, may have never said anything, may have not have been physically affectionate, that his acts of service were affection. And slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers. Now here's a harsh C sound of that house. Chronic means continual, repetitive. So in other words, perhaps they had a very tempestuous relationship. Perhaps the father lost his temper all the time, couldn't control it. You know, he and the son maybe had at each other, speaking indifferently to him who had driven out the cold. So in other words, the son was harsh. The son was cold to the father. All right. And polish my good shoes as well. So this would indicate, of course, getting ready to go to Sunday school, going ready to church, synagogue, whatever. Polished my good shoes as well. All right. What did I know? What did I know? And anytime lines are repeated, it's for emphasis. It's to make a point. Of love's austere and lonely offices. Austere means without decoration. Okay, nothing fancy. And lonely, of course, is being alone. And so the poem ends with these questions it's rhetorical questions, because basically, I don't know if you've ever seen that theory about there are 5 love languages that you can use to show people you love them. One is through words of affirmation or by words. One is by spending time with them. One is by gifts. One is by physical affection, and the last is acts of service. And so this poem reminds me very much of my grandfather, who was a farmer, never showed affection, was a gruff old man, but the way that he showed his family that he loved them was by taking care of them, was by acts of service. And that's really what this poem is about. But the kid, because of his maybe couldn't interpret, felt he needed a different form of love, who knows, but he couldn't interpret these acts of service when he was a kid as love. It was only when he got older that he could see, okay, that's what all this meant. Okay. And so especially this poem is a great one to look at the language, because the language definitely contains a lot of sound effects, a lot of harshness, right? The C's, the B's, throughout, splintering, breaking, the choice of words like splintering and breaking, you can almost hear the sound of the wood popping when it gets really cold. All right. I know this is running a little bit long, but I want to make sure that I cover, because really some of the things I'm telling you now will be on the test, and you may not have picked up on it yourselves or by any of the different activities I had you do. Love and friendship is honestly pretty not that difficult to understand, except a lot of you missed a lot of the figurative language and a lot of the especially the symbolism. So love is like a wild rose briar. Now, a couple of things to notice here. This is a simile. Okay, it's like, anytime you use like or as, it's a kind of a weaker comparison. And by weak, I don't mean less effective. I mean it's more suggestive than being sort of strongly saying love is a wild rose briar. Notice that it's wild and a briar. Okay, wild roses come up without being planted necessarily, and so they come up unexpectedly. Friendship like a holly tree. Now notice both of these can be prickly. Okay, the holly is dark when the rose briar blooms, but which will bloom most constantly? So this is definitely a question and answer format structure here. It's 3 stanzas. The wild rose briar is sweet in spring. So notice it's got seasonal symbolism. Okay, so if you didn't pick up on that, it's got seasonal symbolism, and also uses color. The wild rose briar is sweet in spring, and its summer blossoms scent the air. Yet wait till winter comes again, and who will call the wild briar fair? Have you ever seen in the winter? I've got some roses in my yard, various types, and they don't look great. It gets down to just the branches with the thorns. Okay, so of course, spring when everything starts and it's nice, summer when it's established, yet winter when things get cold. Who will call the wild briar fair? It loses all of its leaves, and it really is just a mangy looking plant, especially if it's not been pruned. Then, now here's your turn, right, with the word then. Scorn the silly rose wreath now, and deck thee with the holly sheen. So the holly is preferable. That when December, so again, you've got the seasonal symbolism here. You're talking December, and then notice the alliteration, blights thy brow. So heavy emphasis here, right? On it's almost like a beating, right? That's cacophonous. He may still leave thy garland green, and green, of course, means life, fresh, growing. So the whole idea, most of you picked up on the fact who did the analysis that December was personified here, because December, it even mentions it as a he. But the point of this particular poem, notice that it's a wild rose. All right, so it's not something that's been cultivated over time. It's something that springs up suddenly, and it can still be very beautiful. So the idea here is that sort of passionate love that comes out of nowhere, but it's not sustainable. It can't last, especially when hard times come. And so the point about this is there are two ways to interpret the theme of this particular poem. One is that friendship, a love relationship that begins in friendship will last longer, right? That when that whole passion burns off eventually, or when things happen where the passion no longer exists, then you still have the friendship. Another interpretation is to not to not leave friendships for love, to not neglect your friends, because that's what's going to last longer, perhaps, than even, especially these quick relationships that come out of nowhere. All right. Next poem, Neutral Tones. Neutral Tones by Thomas Harding. Notice the word neutral, notice tone. So again, if we're talking about symbolism, especially color, neutral tones, there are only a couple of colors mentioned in here. White, which is not really a color. It's almost absence of color. Gray. All right. And so gray especially is something that is it's like between a white and a black. It's an in-between state. And that actually fits what's happening in this poem. So here's our first image. We stood by a pond that winter day. Again, we got winter, so the death of things. And the sun was white as though chidden of God. God was mad. So the sun didn't shine. It's not its usual yellow. And normally the time that, that a sun is white, it's usually there's clouds or something. It almost looks white. And a few leaves lay on the starving sod. Notice the word starving. Okay, and there's alliteration here, the S sounds. They had fallen from an ash and were gray. So ash tree, and obviously they're in the process of dying. So you've got a winter day, you've got white. The scene here is one of desolation. Okay, your eyes on me. Now suddenly we've got the relationship. So the speaker in this poem is talking about a breakup. And now we know in the third stanza, we realize that the speaker is looking back. It's probably a man, but we don't know that for sure because there's no indication. Your eyes on me were as eyes that rove over tedious riddles of long ago. So in other words, looking for some answers in this person, the speaker's face. And some words played between us to and fro. Notice the word played doesn't even mention the words. There's not even any imagery here. There's nothing to hold on to. On which lost the more by our love. Okay. So this is the death of a relationship. This is the death of a love relationship. The smile on your mouth was the deadest thing. In other words, there's no life behind it. It's not a true smile, alive enough to have strength to die. So even that, right, there's nothing behind the smile. And a grin of bitterness swept thereby like an ominous bird a wing. And so the whole idea of an ominous bird a wing, birds were used as omens, especially to read, as the Romans especially, and some other cultures would look at birds flying to get certain omens about what was going to happen. And so that whole idea here, there's almost a dread to the fact that this thing was ending. Since then, keen lessons that love deceives, and this almost gives the indication of why it died. And rings with wrong, alliteration here, rings with wrong, have shaped to me your face and the God-cursed sun. So looking back, this is all this person remembers. Notice that it didn't remember just that sort of foreboding feeling that something was coming. Couldn't even remember the words that they said, your face and the God-cursed sun and a tree, and remembers this image and the pond edged with grayish leaves. So it actually comes full circle. It ends where it begins, but we've got somebody who is actually looking back. And this right here is your turn. Since then, so this is how we know that someone is currently in the present looking back at the death of this relationship. I'm not going to talk about the poem Courage because I think everybody understood it. The whole idea of it was ironic, and the irony of courage of the poem in the poem Courage is the fact that certain things that we would never consider to be courageous were elevated to that level. And then certain things that we think of being kind of absolutely requiring courage, she almost was dismissive about. And I think those are the most problematic lines, quite frankly, in that poem when she talks about war. What is that but love? You know, when someone marches off to sacrifice themselves, what is that but love? It's a good idea, but it does require a great degree of courage as well. So I think minimizing that probably was the weakest part of that particular poem. But everything else, especially any of us who've been bullied, I know several of you wrote about that. If you've ever been bullied, the whole idea of drinking people's acid and taking it, and words being like acid, you know, there's a lot of imagery if you go back and look at it in that particular poem. And it's that too, that poem, because it doesn't really have a turn to it. This poem does, and it's when Aunt is dead. Notice the capitalization there. And again, we've got color. All right, please notice the color. Topaz and denizens in a world of green. Topaz is actually a jewel tone, so that would indicate something valuable. And these tigers, she's doing needlework. She is creating art, but it's needlework with her hands. Notice this fluttering fingers through her wool and find the ivory needle hard to pull. So this is her doing this series of needlework. The massive weight, now here's where we get an idea of what's going on here. She is creating a life or a still life of these tigers who are basically masters of their domain. They do not fear the men, unlike Aunt Jennifer, who fears, right, notice it's terrified hands, back to the wedding ring. She is terrified of the man that she's married to. But the life that she's creating, this art, actually subsumes that. It's the life she would like to have, right? And that's kind of the theme of this poem is how art can actually create a life that we can dream of even if we can't have it. It's part of like how valuable the imagination is. So here's your turn. When Anne is dead, her terrified hands will lie still ringed with ordeals she was mastered by. And so that ringed, and here's the ring again. And notice she was mastered by the things she went through being married to the uncle. The tigers in the panel that she made will go on prancing. They will outlive her. What we understand from this is she's creating a picture of a life she cannot have, but would love to have. And so it's a totally, this is a great word. We use it a lot in literature, juxtaposition, which means you take two things that are unlike each other and put them right next to each other for the purpose of comparison. So in this poem, what is juxtaposed is this some type of abusive relationship, be it emotional or otherwise, that Aunt Jennifer has. Now, of course, the speaker here are Aunt Jennifer's relatives. I realize, you know, that some cultures do call everybody who are older, maybe they're not relatives, but they're aunts or whatever. But that's not the case here. The case here is a relative who's close enough to Aunt Jennifer to understand kind of what's going on in her life. So that's the speaker, right? Nephew, niece, we don't know which. Again, just because the poet is a particular gender, don't assume that the speaker is a particular gender, because I'm certainly, you know, poets will create members of the opposite sex as speakers to speak for them in different circumstances. But anyway, this juxtaposition of what's happening here, you know, is what helps you understand when you get to the turn what the main point of the poem is. All right, I hope this was useful. Good luck on the test. Please email me if you have any questions. And that is it. And don't forget your Grace Week if you need to make up anything.